What's going on, guys? It's Chris Toro. So I just now finally finished Outlast 2 on the Nintendo Switch on both normal and hard difficulty settings, just to make sure some of the caveats that people were saying the game had didn't roll over to hard mode. The first thing you'll notice with Outlast 2 is that it's one of the most beautifully ugly games on the Nintendo Switch. While playing it on my TV, it felt like more of a simulation of Outlast 2, opposed to a Nintendo Switch port. Everything about it felt like the genuine Outlast 2 experience that I know of. Every character has that overly detailed skin texture that kind of looks like leather. The blood and gore will get you sick to your stomach because of its realism. The environments are well polished and just as highly detailed as the characters themselves. So in that right, the atmosphere blends well with the characters as well as the monsters. So just know, when it comes to the graphics alone, Outlast 2 is pretty much the best looking Switch game to date. Somehow it looks even better than Doom, Resident Evil Revelations 2, and even Bayonetta 2. The details in Outlast 2 are sharp, multi-textured and layered, has the appropriate lighting, and even ambient occlusion. So there's no need to worry about if this game looks as good as the original Outlast 2. Sure, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but comparably it does look good enough to complete the experience. Besides the aesthetics of it, the difficulty and pacing of Outlast 2 is done pretty well here. While it does start off slow, when you eventually get the ball rolling, the action and horror get cranked up to 11. And having completed Outlast 1, I was pleasantly surprised to see that Red Barrel still had a lot up their sleeve, almost redefining paranoia and survival horror altogether. Even when it comes to figuring out the situational puzzles, your route and ways to solving it are more obscure, which I like. It's not always find the key card or another way around this door. Instead of that, there are a lot more intricate ways to get to one path, and you'll have to search high and low just to find a way to where you're going. And with that said, I understand what people were talking about with Outlast 2's confusing puzzles. It does tend to get borderline ridiculous, because there are a lot of objects that are interactive, so it becomes hard to guess exactly what you have to do in that specific situation. For example, there was an instance where I had to cross a cliff. Because there were rocks blocking my path, I couldn't jump over. So for the first time without warning, the game required me to push something over to make a path of my own. And no time after that or before that moment do you have to push that specific object to cross a path. It only happens once. So suffice it to say, I was a bit frustrated at that moment, and other moments that were asking for ridiculous solutions, like finding the smallest crevice to crawl through in a grassy and woodland area. It happens multiple times, but I didn't find myself getting used to finding those hidden paths. They were almost always difficult to find. I'm all for challenging puzzles, but when it comes to progressing through the stage, I rather deal with an actual puzzle opposed to an obstruction that's just preventing me from getting from one side of the wall to another. Even though Outlast is known for those kind of events, and Outlast 2, they also cranked that up to 11. And unfortunately, it clashes with a lot of the tension, paranoia, and suspense of those moments. While you're trying to look for hidden doors or something to knock over, in the background there's always a tension-filled soundtrack. And even though the soundtrack is well done, eventually after hearing it for 15 minutes straight, it's going to get annoying, especially when there's no one chasing you and the only thing you're doing is getting lost. Another thing those moments do is halt your pacing. Outlast 2 tries to take advantage of the open environments, but instead has you Easter egg hunting. Instead of using most of those environments to introduce a new unique character and implement them into that stage, you're stuck being stuck without a feeling of tension or paranoia that the game usually gives you. Those random boring moments of finding where to go is probably the biggest negative of Outlast 2. So with that finally out of my system, Outlast 2 does consist of very original horror moments, but it also has a lot of cliche horror moments, like quieting down the scene for an eventual jump scare. But fortunately, there are only 2 or 3 cliche scares in the game that make you feel like you're going through a haunted house. Besides that, Outlast 2 actually pulls its punches in terms of scaring to deliver more tension-filled scenes. Like with those quiet moments, sometimes they won't deliver a jump scare after, just to drive the tension up. But I do have to admit, they do that a little too much, to the point I expected not to get scared. A lot of people were having issues with Outlast 2 not being as scary as the first, even though it's not as scary as the first by a not too big margin. At times the game can feel like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Descent, and even The Conjuring, though I like those twists and turns and changes of tones since it made me feel like I was playing a Shinji Mikami game. Just like with Shinji Mikami's latest Evil Within series, tonally Outlast 2 goes everywhere. It seemed like the developers were pretty high on the success of Part 1 and just threw some of their most outrageous ideas at the story and gameplay, sometimes doing a 180 and changing up the tone of the gameplay completely. Unfortunately, some of those tones don't mix, and in times like those it sometimes feels like you're playing an entirely different game. Though I get the premise of using different types of environments to supplement the story, in the end it more so so hurts the pacing of the game opposed to aiding its narrative. There were moments that were sprinkled throughout the game and enemy types entirely. If that certain segment was saved for the later half of Outlast 2, it would have been more involving and less confusing. For example, sometimes you're running away from a group of enemies and then without warning go into a quick transition to a new environment entirely. I knew where I was and I get what they were doing with that transition, but I can see that being confusing for a lot of people. Like I said in the video before this, it's more recommended to read the Outlast graphic novel, The Murkov Account, before playing Outlast 2, just so you can get a good bearing of the story. And in my understanding, I know that a lot of people didn't even know that comic existed. So going into it and out of it, a lot of gamers are going to be confused. But trust me, after reading that graphic novel, everything was a lot more clear, and the story was that much more impactful. Even the ending had a lot of meaning and open-endedness. But from what I understand, a lot of people took the ending very literally, as well as what was going on throughout the game. Like a lot of other growing franchises, Red Barrels is trying to expand on the Outlast universe, and given how many unknown elements are introduced in this game, they might have been trying too hard, as well as relying on the comic too heavily. I know they were trying to stray away from the Resident Evil tropes of looking for exposition notes just to explain what's going on with the world, given that most of the notes in Outlast 2 are kind of useless and leave you in the dark literally and figuratively for the most part. And also to add, Outlast 2 throws a lot of religious droning in your face. Whenever you pick up notes, you're most likely going to read a couple verses from the Bible that were twisted around by these delusional people. For the most part, you're going to see a lot of God or gospel or Trinity or something like that. So it could be a bit overwhelming and still confusing when it comes to the topic of religion in Outlast 2. So if you're one to not like religion being pushed on you or shoved in your face, you might find the narrative of Outlast 2 a bit intolerable, as it grazes over and lathers this topic on you too many times to count. I'm not exactly against it, but if you are a person that can't tolerate that kind of stuff, this is just a little warning. But because they're trying to expand on the universe in Outlast 2, they leave it up to the player to search for the answers themselves, just like how these journalists are portrayed to be doing. But as a game, it doesn't really work that well. If the main character could have a decryptor and can use his video camera and the footage he collected to research for himself what's going on, that would have been more ideal. Besides the story, the main character is another issue. All he's trying to do is simply look for his wife, when he's supposed to be part of a journalistic team that's in search for answers. The reason why they're there is to find answers. So even though he does document some of it, most of what he was documenting was emotional, and it wasn't clear if he really wanted to find the answers more than he wanted to find his wife. Even his wife at times didn't seem interested as to what was going on, maybe because everything was masked so perfectly. But at times there were obvious clues, and knowing that world's history, just like the first protagonist, this journalistic couple should have put two and two together by the end at least, but they didn't, and were just caught up in the insanity of what was going on. So moving on from the narrative, the gameplay of Outlast 2 is very reminiscent to the first one. You can hide in closets, under beds, or behind objects to get away from enemies, but adding on to that, you can also crawl, move objects more freely, and even while you're running, if you press the crouch button, you could slide, so you can recuperate right after you get past an obstruction. You can even strafe jump left and right, as well as back, to dodge enemy attacks. All in all, the gameplay is very fluid, and it's meant to give you more of the sense of freedom. Your character isn't as stiff or bound to specific objects in the environment. You can pretty much interact with almost everything, and go mostly anywhere you want. Just like the story, the environment is also expanded in Outlast 2. Even the running mechanic gives you momentum so you can run faster the longer you run. There's a lot added to Outlast 2, to the point sometimes it doesn't even feel like an Outlast game. Sometimes that's a good thing, and other times confusing, given that Outlast 2 takes place a couple months after the first, from what I understand. Even the timeline of this game will be a mystery to you. So if you're expecting a sequel that picks up where the last one left off, you're better off reading the graphic novels for that transition, to bridge the gap between 1 and 2. As well as the numerous challenges of narrative, the game is only actually challenging when you're trying to find out where to go. In normal difficulty at least, a lot of enemies don't do one-hitters. They usually do warning shots and let you run away for the eventual execution. For the most part, enemies are just there to intimidate, and not to do one-shot kills like in the first Outlast. If you'd like a more challenging experience, it'll be better to go to the hard, nightmare, or insane difficulty. But that change does come with a scarcity of bandages and batteries, as well as the excessive consumption of battery life. So though you have the challenge there, it might also be weighed down by some item scarcity. Outlast 2 is quite an ambitious game. With there being some confusing and negative aspects to it, there's just as many and even more good scares and gameplay aspects to it. If you're jumping into the Outlast series for the first time, I recommend playing 2 first, and then 1, and reading the graphic novel to clear everything up. In the end, Outlast 2's survival horror approach does provide a lot of terrifying, adrenaline-filled, and intense moments that I know to be in the first Outlast as well. It's definitely not as grounded or unsettling as part 1, or even as gruesome, but there still is a lot of disturbing imagery that'll give you nightmares at least. I'm not one to get scared easy when it comes to horror games, and there were moments where I just wanted my character to die just so I could stop looking at that disturbing image. There's a lot of moments where Outlast 2 pushes you to the point where you might want to quit, and that's the point of an Outlast game, to push you to your limits. And in that right, I can't help but compliment the game for that. In terms of being a sequel, Outlast 2 does a great job. I really enjoyed most of what the game provided. Though it's not the scariest or most involving thing I've ever played, if you are into survival horror, I'm going to recommend it, and give Outlast 2 an 8 out of 10. It's terrifying, clever, and at times very original. And of course, it's also a gorgeous looking game, and one of the best looking on the Switch right now. And if you give that graphic novel a read, I can almost guarantee that you'll be hooked just like I am, and you'll appreciate the clever narrative a lot more. And with that, guys, thanks for watching. See you guys in the next video. Have a good one. Later.
This is gospel for the fallen ones, locked away in permanent slumber, assembling their philosophies from pieces of